He speaks about God's love and about how we should be loving our neighbor, but he also shows up even when it's not easy.
This is Citywell, a church that accepts everyone regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, or nationality. Since its founding in 2011, Citywell has grown from a startup United Methodist church to a community that stands up for each other no matter what.
So in 2010, the Office of New Faith Communities reached out to me on behalf of the bishop and said the cabinet is praying about starting a new church in downtown Durham, and we would like for you to pray about being the pastor there. We started talking in 2006 about a hope that we would get to plant a church, like start a new thing in downtown Durham. And that conversation had come back around over the course of the next 4 years at different points, but always in very kind of passing ways. You know, it's kind of, wouldn't it be amazing if we got to start a new church in downtown Durham? So then we get this call, and that's the call, and you know, it's just like, wow, I mean, this is the Holy Spirit, right? Even at work in the United Methodist Church, can you believe how good and powerful God is? You know, so it was a really fun moment. We called it the big scary dream. We asked God to give us a vision that was so outside of our experience that we would know it didn't come from our own inclinations, and that it would be so unlikely of success that if it succeeded, people would only be able to say, look at God. It wasn't until recently that Citywell kind of became a recognizable name, where people would hear, they'd come to Durham and be like, oh, I've heard about Citywell, and so they'd come check it out. That's actually a new phenomenon for this church. You know, so we started with an emphasis on who we're becoming as a community together.
We started going to Citywell in November of 2016. Our son had just been born, Sammy, and we had a 2-year-old, and we were looking for a church that was diverse, but that also had a lot of kids, and sort of just kind of aligned a little bit more with what we believe Jesus would do if he were around. There's a lot of warmth.
You know, we have been a body in formation the entire time. You know, we're constantly changing because who's a part of this church is constantly changing, and because we've intentionally postured ourselves in a way where the people who come into this life with us actually change our life together.
I think we just wanted to see God working in places of reconciliation and injustice and in places where there's inequality. And while I've seen churches kind of make social justice their God, I feel like the heart and the soul of Citywell is the love of God.
There is a unfortunately uncommon holding together of a passionate Jesus-centric worship with a passionate political engagement. Every Sunday, we offer some expression of response to what's been proclaimed, and we open the floor, and anyone can speak. You know, who has the ability to speak and affect what's happening in the room? Everybody does. You know, who has the right and the prerogative to be the voice of God into somebody's life in this space? Everybody does.
When I was in the hospital, Cleve was there, as well as several other people from Citywell. Yeah, they're the people that I can depend on when things get rough.
Though joyous music rings throughout the church, it can't be forgotten that somebody isn't here. One might wonder where Cleve's ideas of radical love came from. After one look, however, it's clear a majority of them began in his childhood.
I think I generally had a really wonderful childhood. I have a family that's very close and parents that I admire very much. And our home was one in which faith was central and dynamic. Jesus was always someone that I wanted to know, not just some doctrine or some distant God.
Cleve was a fireball. He was super, super fun kid.
My family was a deeply faithful family, but coming out of a tradition that didn't make immediate connections between our faith and our politics. Jesus isn't abstract. You know, we read stories about Jesus in relationship with people. Like, we only know Jesus through the stories we have, and those stories are about Jesus in relationship. And so I think that was how I came to understand my faith, was a life lived in relationship with people, and relationships built on love and grace and forgiveness and inclusion and scandalous friendships. I would say my ideas about immigration were formed by really crude and frankly racist cultural narratives. As a privileged white kid in a fairly wealthy community, our views were not compassionate views. I certainly didn't grow up understanding all of the complexities that I'm now coming to understand about why we have the kind of migration we have.
Following an upbringing of faith and active church participation, Cleve was seeking deeper spiritual development, and he enrolled in Duke Divinity School.
Divinity School was delightful and frightful and deeply disruptive in ways that I'm very grateful for. I was, deeply formed by an evangelical expression of Christianity from 18 to 24. So I remember, when I started Divinity School was right after we invaded Iraq in 2003. And at that point, I was as gung-ho, rah-rah American as any good Southern boy, in just an unquestioning way. And I didn't question violence, that it was righteous in my eyes that we would go, bomb some country, especially some Muslim country. I mean, there was all this just awful stuff that I was raised with, not actively by my parents, but in the culture and in that particular stream of Christianity. You don't question the fact that sometimes you just got to kill people. And these friends of mine, this one is a Mennonite pastor. His name's Isaac Villegas. I don't know if you know Isaac, but he was one of us that got arrested. And Isaac is a Mennonite. The Mennonites will mess with you if you let them, because they start asking questions like, so who would Jesus drop a bomb on first? It's like, don't ask me that, And another one another friend, Jonathan, had flown to Baghdad and had embedded with a family in Baghdad before the bombing began, with a whole team of Mennonite peacekeepers to say to the Iraqi people, what's happening to you isn't Christianity, it's United States politics, and Christianity is we're here to die with you.
After finishing Divinity School and starting Citywell, Cleve was introduced to a man named Samuel Oliver Bruno, who was an undocumented immigrant seeking sanctuary within a church.
Following President Trump's election, 2016, early 2017, we're having conversations around what does it mean for us to love our neighbors well, particularly the neighbors who feel most threatened, and particularly our Latino neighbors. A bunch of the folks here work at the Divinity School in the Hispanic House of Studies, and they put together an event for church leaders and congregations to be exposed to the sanctuary movement as a possible avenue to be engaged in solidarity and neighbor love with immigrant communities. In the summer of 2017, the leadership team asked for one of our Latina church members to bring in some folks to talk more directly to us as a leadership team about sanctuary and what that might look like. That would have been in August, I believe. We had that meeting with those folks, and as a leadership team, we're deliberating after those people had left, and our our friend Katerine, who had brought them and had been a leader in our church for a couple of years at that point, had been really quiet. And I said, after about 2 hours and about to close the meeting, I said, Katerine, you've been very quiet. What are you thinking? And she got really emotional and talked about how her family had actually been taken into sanctuary for 2 years in Texas. And she said, if a church had not taken my family into sanctuary, I wouldn't be here right now. And I would say, from my perspective, in that moment, we became a sanctuary church.
We had gotten an email and some phone calls that our church was interested in providing sanctuary to someone. And everything happened very, very quickly. I think it was like a matter of a week or less. Some folks from church, Ismael and Alma, knew Samuel and his family. They knew that he had gotten a deportation order. He went to the pastors and said, hey, if we're going to do this sanctuary thing, here's a great opportunity with a wonderful person.
Ismael and Alma Ruiz are part of this church family and have been since the very beginning. And they were formerly Samuel's pastors in Greenville. And so when his deportation order was activated, he reached out to his former pastors and asked for help, and they came to us as their church family and said, what can we do? Our conversations with and about hosting Samuel were the end of November, and then Samuel moved in on December 10th.
Samuel didn't have any kind of record except entering when he entered, and so he didn't drink. I've never heard him speak more than just like this normal conversation tone. Like he's just a quiet, like good person. He was just trying to take care of his family.
It was in the end of November that we heard from Samuel, and we had not done all of our work. And we had to quicken the pace of neighborhood listening and finalize things with attorneys and just very quickly, because Samuel's window of time was very short. So the all of a suddenness is certainly what we felt in relationship with Samuel, but we had been for months kind of working toward this possibility. I just don't think any of us imagined it would happen so quickly. We imagined that maybe one day we'll be a sanctuary church, but that one day came very immediately.
Every year he would do a check-in just to make sure he was okay to stay in the country. He didn't have any kind of status, but it was just like a check-in. It was just making sure. And then at that check-in, they had said, here's your deportation order, more or less. Almost
Nightly, somebody would bring a meal, and most of the time share that meal with Samuel. He enjoyed eating meals with people, enjoys, I suppose. People would bring groceries every week and do laundry every week. There were folks who did ESL classes here with Samuel. Samuel had a small group Bible study that he led on Thursday nights. And then a lot of people would come and work here during the day so that they could just be present in the space in case anything were to ever happen. So there were a whole lot of people throughout the community, and including folks in this congregation, who were involved in this work.
I don't know, Samuel became a part of our family because we were eating together so regularly. And having kids that were as small as they are, it was very chaotic trying to eat with two small children in an in a church basement, more or less. And so they were running around and being crazy, and we were constantly like trying to redirect them. And Samuel never once seemed irritated. He just has a very, very gentle and kind and generous soul. And so I never felt bad that my kids were misbehaving, and he still smiled at them and still greeted them and loved them. And every time we would leave, Sammy and Marley would give him hugs, and they'd say bye and we'll see you later. Yeah, just the way that he interacted with our kids while he was at Citywell, it showed me a lot about who he is, who his character is.
He is an incredibly, I would say, delightful person. Like, always going to have a smile, always going to greet you with joy. But he's an unassuming person. So he's not a big personality, draw all the attention to himself kind of person. But he would jump in to help, and he worked hard all the time. Like on any given Sunday morning, you'd see him up here setting up chairs and Or I'd show up in the middle of the week and he'd be downstairs like remodeling something, making things better.
Even while he was there, we were still like working on the bathrooms and working on his space, and then while he was there, he was also working on his space and building walls and painting.
I really love watching him with his son. He's just a really tender dad, and he's so proud of his son. And so I always enjoy watching him with Danielle. And then I find that he's what he did in coming here was profoundly courageous. And he did that in a very sacrificial way. It was about him and his family, but it was always explicitly about other people and how his choice to be here might make a better outcome for other folks. I'm very grateful for my friendship with Samuel. He's a good man.
After spending almost a year in sanctuary, Samuel went to the USCIS office, thinking that he would be taking steps towards citizenship. This, however, was not what greeted him upon arrival.
We all knew that there was risk involved, but Samuel is his own person, and he chose to go. We're still to this day not sure that he understood fully the risk that was involved. Not that he wasn't capable of understanding; he's totally capable of understanding. But we don't know that it was explained to him clearly enough. Cleve did a little conversation about what to do and what to expect, and even if we were to expect if the worst were to happen, that these were the things that we should do and we should know about civil disobedience. We went in nervous but hopeful, and we made sure that he never left sanctuary.
I was in Lexington, North Carolina that morning and drove here early, about 6 a.m., and met a bunch of folks here at the church who were going to caravan over to take Samuel to the CIS appointment. And we met here and prayed and jumped into cars and went to the CIS office.
So the general vibe of the crowd, you have to understand that on the day of Samuel's deportation, we were there for completely different reasons. We were there we were there very hopeful that this was going to be a step in the right direction, and you kind of see all that fade away very quickly.
We were aware that, like, in theory, ICE might try to do something because ICE has proven to be fairly rogue in their tactics. But I don't think any of us thought they actually would.
While we were at the church, we even said, it was told to us, these are the things that we should watch out for. So when we got there, of course, we were like keeping an eye out, and we didn't think anything, we didn't see anything to be concerned about.
When we arrived, there was nothing that we saw that suggested that this was a trap. The folks who detained Samuel were dressed in plain clothes. Some of them, in my seeing of them, intentionally to look like immigrants. They were posing as if they were filling out paperwork, some of them standing in line. It was not something that we saw coming. I would say that it was a very aggressive, very physically aggressive arrest. I was, I think I was scared, but there was so much adrenaline. I also remember, standing in front of an ICE officer and just saying, "You don't have to do this. You don't have to do this." And I remember clasping my hands together in front of myself so that they wouldn't perceive that I was trying to threaten them, But just standing there and saying, "Please stop. I see what's happening right here." There was an instance where, as I know them to be, ICE officers were trying to pull Danielle away from his dad one of them put Danielle in a chokehold and was squeezing really tightly. And Danielle was going like blue in the face. And I remember I was thinking like, oh my God, this is Eric Gardner happening all over again. And I literally got down in that officer's face and yelled, "I see you choking him, I see you choking him." And the guy let go of the chokehold. So it was just chaotic and loud, and it was a frightening space.
The arrest was the easy part. It was the time that people were there during those hours that were probably the most tense.
Wednesdays became really painful because that's when we were supposed to eat with Samuel. Yeah. My kids asking about him was really hard. So yeah, and we had all gone with Samuel to that appointment, including the kids. And so they kind of were like, what's going on? And so I did have to explain that that they had taken Samuel and that they sent Samuel to another country, and trying to have those conversations with a 4-year-old is like, she just doesn't understand.
I mean, there was a lot that happened that was very spontaneous. The surrounding of the van, that was not a plan. That just happened. The singing and the praying just happened. And I do remember a dynamic where like a voice would just come up and we would just join that voice in song, and then somebody else would start singing and we would join that voice in song, and somebody would pray and somebody would read scripture, and it was a very improvisational worship service happening around an ice van.
So the general feel was that we had been there for 3 hours. So this wasn't just one of those things that had just occurred and then 30 minutes later we were done. We were there for a very long time, and it was almost, I don't want to call it anticlimactic, but it was the end.
She said to me, Marley said, why did they steal Samuel? And that's something I'll never be able to get out of my head. Why did they steal Samuel? Because that's what it felt like, and that's what it looked like. He'd almost been in sanctuary for a year. He was about 10 days away from having been in sanctuary for an entire year.
While some applauded the bravery of those who tried to help Samuel, others thought the actions that took place were despicable and wanted to make their opinions known.
We received some package, like we had to have the police come and open some packages that looked pretty frightening. We had direct threats and had to have a police presence here on the couple Sundays following all of this. A lot of voicemails and emails that were violent in a lot of ways. So yeah, we've experienced a lot of really ugly responses. There are conversations that have been happening around like literally, like, what do we do if a shooter comes in?
There were definitely messages that were sent to the church that were a little, that were unfriendly. We did have police presence for a week or two on Sunday after it happened.
I try really hard never to hate people, because I think when we hate people, our own humanity is what is wounded. Hatred is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. It always backfires. And so I pray for people a lot. When Jesus said, "Pray for those that persecute you," I think he says that not for the people who persecute us, but for us, because it's very difficult to hate people you pray for. And if we're free of hate, then hate can't kill us.
Not only did they face backlash from the online community, they also faced consequences from the law.
When we all got put into the detention center, they split us up into guys and girls. You move rooms, so you get put into a holding cell, and then you get put into the actual detention center after you get processed. So you get your mug shot, and then you actually go into the detention center afterwards. And what ended up happening was, and this is luckily changed, was that this was prior to the election, so ICE had an actual office in the detention center when we were there. So what we found really interesting, and what I thought was just flat out racist, was that every Hispanic person that went with us got sent to that ICE office before they actually got processed with all of us.
You know, I remember watching some of my friends who were arrested with us being taken back to an office. Over the door, it just said ICE. And not all of us were taken back there, only those of us with brown skin. You know, and that caused a lot of confusion and fear, like what's happening to our friends.
The one nice part was that during that time, Samuel was actually in the cell, in the detention center with us, and he was in a separate cell. So we could still see him, and we all kind of, without being able to say anything, all the arrestees kind of got to have that extra goodbye that nobody else got to have in it. And then we were able to reconnect with Daniel and get him out of there before the media jumped on top of him. So, but yeah, I think about 7 hours. I would put about that. So.
You know, it was a really multifaceted experience. So on the one hand, there's weeping. You know, it's heartbreaking. And at different points, they moved us from cell to cell, and there was one point at which we could see Samuel in a cell across the way. And you know, you have this thick glass wall, so you can't hear each other, but you know, you're making eyes with each other, and you're speaking with your eyes in ways, and it was heartbreaking. And then there was certainly fatigue and exhaustion, and there was laughter. You know, it was like this fully human experience of all these different emotions kind of crashing together in this space of shared suffering and sadness and conviction, and this sense of doing what the right thing was to do.
And actually with Samuel, they didn't have him in the system for hours, and so I was there with his friends and with a lawyer trying to get him his medicine for his diabetes, and because he wasn't registered in the system, because he was under a federal detainer, not a local one, it took us a really long time to figure out that he was there and for them to accept the medication that he needed.
The question of how someone could sacrifice so much for a person is a confounding one. What leads to such extreme self-sacrifice?
Citywell is a very diverse place, racially and culturally, and these relationships and these friendships have changed me deeply. So, for instance, caring about immigration or race, these aren't ideological positions we take because of our politics. This is a literal application of love your neighbor as yourself. Well, my neighbor is Samuel. My neighbor is Ismael and Alma. My neighbor is Katerine. My neighbor is Lisette. My neighbor is all these different folks. And my neighbor is terrified of what our government's doing and whether or not their family and their friends or they are going to show up at home after work, or are they going to get put in a detention center and deported? Are they ever going to see their kids again?
So how can they help their friends and neighbors? These are a few things that have been done in an attempt to improve immigrants' life here in the United States.
I know part of our court case right now, I think, is advocating for Samuel by using what we have done to remind the people of what happened to him, because it was an injustice against him.
Our court cases, are an ongoing witness to the public.
I think the first thing that me and Kim have done is really just make sure that their family is doing all right.
You know, I think a lot of our energy right now is around how do we support Danielle and Julia, you know, who are still here with us. How do we remain in relationship with Samuel and encourage him, you know? But you know, if Samuel's going to be reunited with his family, I think it'll be because something in the much larger picture changes around immigration practices in this country. I mean, it's easy to say my understanding of the lived experience of undocumented people in this country is phenomenally different than it was. I have a profound respect for the folks who endure what they endure to live here.
The actions of Cleve May and Sitywell have inspired many. But what inspires them?
I want to receive the ways of Jesus as my way of life. I think that's the way of full humanity. It's who I hope to become.